Hey there, everybody. Welcome to the Birds Nest Podcast. I'm Joe Donahue. Thank you so much for joining us. Eagles football is back at Lincoln Financial Field for the first time this season. The Eagles will be returning to play the Atlanta Falcons Monday night on ESPN, Monday Night Football. It's going to be a blast, and the environment is going to be electric. Yes, the Eagles technically had a home game while they were in Sao Paulo. Yes, there was even a watch party at Lincoln Financial Field. But Eagles football being played live at Lincoln Financial Field just hits different than any other environment you can watch Eagles football in. ESPN even knows this because they are having 2 live broadcasts from Xfinity Live in the hours leading up to the game. NFL Live and Monday Night Countdown, featuring former Eagles center Jason Kelce, will both be broadcast from Xfinity Live. All the details are on your screen and in the description. Now, as for the action on the field, we definitely need to take a look at this because the Eagles are going up against an opponent that they should beat. But if the Eagles repeat some of the stuff that was experienced last week, it's not going to go so well for the team. Now, mind you, again, I do expect the Eagles to win this game against the Atlanta Falcons. The Atlanta Falcons just did not impress anybody at all during the preceding week. But there are some areas of concern for the Eagles that they're going to want to use this game as an opportunity to nip in the bud. So I want to start by looking at the offense, and there were some really good things about the offense. 410 yards total during the game against the Green Bay Packers to start the season. There were 266 passing yards, 144 rushing yards. There was a lot of good to be had there. But a big area of concern for me is going to be third down conversions. The Eagles converted just 4 of the 14 attempts that they had on third down. And long term, that's not sustainable. And I'm going to be looking for the Eagles to have significantly better third down performance against the Atlanta Falcons. The Eagles just kind of have to be in that mode. And that also brings me to making sure that the rust is shaken off of Jalen Hurts. Because Jalen Hurts made some good throws over the course of week 1, and he made some throws that left a lot to be desired, notably the couple interceptions. Now, the first one was a really good read by Xavier McKinney, but the second one, while yes, you could make an argument that the field was slippery, A.J. Brown could have gotten there. At best, it would have been a 50-50 ball if you actually go back and watch the tape. Jalen Hurts needed to make sure that that ball was placed in a spot where A.J. Brown and only A.J. Brown could get it, and should not have underthrown the ball. Similarly, when it came to some of the fumbles, Jalen and Cam Jurgens need to be on point when it comes to that kind of stuff. The Eagles had a turnover the first time. The second time that the Eagles fumbled it, both of the fumbles were on the snap, by the way. The second time that the Eagles fumbled it, Saquon Barkley was fortunate to fall on top of it, but that cost the Eagles an opportunity for a touchdown when they were within brotherly shove range. So, making sure that some of those things are fine-tuned on the offensive side of the football, third down conversions particularly, as well as holding on to the football, needs to happen. Additionally, I'm going to be looking offensively at continuing to utilize Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley, as we all know, had 3 touchdowns. 2 of them were rushing touchdowns. 1 of them came through the air during the opener against Green Bay. Now, Nick Sirianni addressed earlier this week the use of Saquon Barkley and how they're going to manage him over the course of this week, given his incredibly high workload.
Yeah, obviously you do everything you can do to win each football game. And so once the game's in the flow, you think about how you're going to win that game, and whether that's Saquon getting 20 whatever touches, whether that's us throwing the ball to AJ, Devontae, Dallas, whatever it may be. You try to manage them more within practice. So something like that with Saquon having that many touches, we'll have a plan for that this week in practice, where we can take some of the load off them there. But every time you go into the game, every game's so important in the NFL that it's hard to to say when he's got a hot hand like that too, to say, hey, you don't want to keep giving him the ball because you're trying to win every single game that you play. So again, that's our job as coaches to manage that throughout the week during practice, and games will take care of itself as it goes. Like, there's going to be naturally a game where we throw it 50 times, or Kenny or Will have a couple carries. So that will take care of itself throughout the year, and as of right now, we handle that through our practice.
But just because they're going to scale back on him in practice does not mean that the Eagles should be looking to move away from things like a solid run game. The Eagles need to continue to stick with the run. That was what made them successful in years past. That is what is going to continue to make them successful. Sticking with the run, making sure that the run is being utilized effectively to set up the pass. That's different from how the league has turned in general, but it's what has worked for the Eagles and what I expect will continue to work. We're going to turn to the defense now to take a look at some of the things that the defense needs to look at. And the big thing that I'm going to say is recovering from what happened last week. The Eagles dropped 400 yards on the Packers, but the Packers also dropped 400 yards on the Eagles. And again, field conditions, you could make an argument, have something to do with that. I was maybe a little too critical of C.J. Gardner-Johnson in light of the field conditions. I am going to walk some of that criticism back. I'll give him an opportunity to impress me over the course of this week. But the Eagles have to be better at blocking and tackling than they were last week. Because at its core, the Eagles' defense is vastly superior to the Falcons' offense. The Falcons were only able to put together 226 yards, and they were unable to defeat a Pittsburgh Steelers team that didn't score a single touchdown against the Falcons last week. A big part of that is going to be getting to Kirk Cousins, who was 16 for 26 with the Falcons last week against the Steelers. Cousins was also sacked twice. So this is going to be really important for the Eagles to be able to capitalize on that, increase the number of sacks that Kirk Cousins is dealing with. Kirk Cousins has never really played the Eagles well, especially since the Eagles have typically played him during prime time. But the Eagles are going to need to depend on increased production from the front four, from Bryce Huff, who was almost non-existent over the course of the preceding week. And we're going to need to expect continued production from guys like Nakobe Dean and Zach Bond at linebacker, who really excelled last week. I was really impressed with both of them. Nakobe Dean had 4 tackles, including 2 for a loss, and Zach Bond seemed to be everywhere against the Green Bay Packers. He had 15 combined tackles, 11 of them were solo tackles, 2 sacks, and 1 other tackle for a loss. Going into last week, linebacker was my biggest question. I am really thrilled with the performance that was put on by both of these two guys. The next thing that I'm going to be expecting is going to be toning it down on the number of penalties. The Eagles had 7 penalties to the Green Bay Packers 10. Of the 7 penalties, 5 of them came against the defense. There were a couple of pass interference penalties that were called. Tristan McCullum was called for an illegal blindside block. Jalen Carter was called early on in the game for an unnecessary roughness penalty as he was getting up after a play. And the Eagles defense in general was called by the refs for too many men on the field, which fortunately the Packers were also called for too many men on the field on that same play, and it negated a touchdown. That having been said, the Eagles have to tighten up on penalties. Penalties will kill you in the midst of a game. The Eagles' 7 penalties cost them 57 yards last week and handed the Green Bay Packers 3 first downs. Not great in terms of numbers. Not the worst in the league, but certainly not great. So the Eagles are going to need to improve in the penalty numbers. There's no reason to give the Atlanta Falcons any more help than they need. And the last thing that I'm going to be looking at least highlighting in this episode, is game management. Now, Nick Sirianni handed off the play calling responsibilities to the offensive coordinator a couple of seasons ago. Shane Steichen, then Brian Johnson, now Kellen Moore. Kellen Moore has a little bit more responsibility for the offensive scheme, but that allows Nick Sirianni to do things that are a little bit broader in terms of game management. Things like managing the clock, things like making sure that special teams is going well, making sure that the defense is going well. It allows him to be more of like the CEO kind of head coach. And that became even more so when he handed over the offensive schematic responsibilities to Kellen Moore as well. That freed him up. Nick Sirianni was actually asked about this earlier in the week, and he had the opportunity to address those things that he is now more free to do during the game when he's not so focused on having to run the offense.
The reason I gave up the play calling, to Shane a couple years ago was because I wanted to manage the game better. And so I felt like, we've already been on that step of, hey, this is why I kind of gave this up initially, is the game management portion of it. And so I think that's similar. I think that, from the years past, because I wasn't calling it, the last 3 years, I was still being able to manage the game. Well, it's the same thing here. I'm not calling it, and I'm here. I think one thing though it does is like instead of having to be in every offensive meeting, and I've talked about not going just to the offensive meetings, but also going to the defensive meetings, right, to be able to kind of hear what's going on in special teams meetings. But also when we go to a Tuesday where it's our game plan day, which is going to be all messed up here this week too because we played Monday night. It gives me an opportunity to kind of look around the league and do some game management things while maybe the offense is getting ready. I'll pop in and out of the offense to hear the game planning to get my expertise into that. But what it allows me to do is like, okay, I don't have to be in there at all times. I can study fourth down decisions. I can study throughout the league. I can study 2-point decisions throughout the league. I can watch all the 4 minutes throughout the league because, and 2 minutes and all those different scenarios throughout the league that are gonna. It's just like practice, right? You're putting yourself in these scenarios so you can kind of think through your process, and then you got to go back into the offensive meeting and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking here in these scenarios. Not necessarily play wise, but hey, whether it's run, pass, aggressive, not aggressive, these different things. And so that's where I think, it's a really good question. And that's where I think it's different, that I have a little bit more time to study that, on Tuesday, as opposed to what's different on game day, if that makes sense.
The fact that the Eagles had a 4-minute drill that basically took 7 minutes off of the clock is really impressive. The Eagles had one of those at the end of the Tampa Bay game last year. And that's a real testament to being able to manage the game and manage the flow of the game. Time of possession is really important. The Eagles did win that battle in the end, which I was concerned about after the first quarter when the Packers were really dominant and the Eagles were basically giving the ball over. Meanwhile, in last week's game, the Falcons lost the time of possession battle to the Pittsburgh Steelers by over 10 minutes. So I am expecting the Eagles to keep their foot on the gas here, be able to control the flow of the game through its entirety against the Atlanta Falcons. So those are the things that I'm going to be looking out for, but what are you looking out for as you head into this game? What are the things that you're going to be watching for to see how the Eagles are doing? Let me know. And thank you so much to everybody for tuning into the Bird's Nest Podcast. You can support the Bird's Nest Podcast by liking and subscribing to Bird's Nest Media right here on YouTube, as well as by sharing to your social media pages. You can also find us on SoundCloud, iTunes, Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, and the Odyssey app. Please visit birdsnestmedia.com for additional Eagles coverage. And if you feel so inclined to support us in a different way, you can find the link to our Patreon in the description below or at birdsnestmedia.com. Thank you so much for tuning in. And let's go, Eagles.